Good evening. This is live from Londinium. The Fans of History Debating Society asked me to mention to the Friends of History Debating Society that this conversation is taking place in severe wintry conditions here in Londinium, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with a wind chill. Those of us who've been out in it take that very seriously. That means you no longer have 10 fingers after about 15 minutes if you're not careful. Also, stumbling around in snowdrifts with ice on the top is engaging only if you're a Springer Spaniel, not if you're a human being. However, I've survived like Lucy and Desi in Connecticut, if you watch that part of the episode. It gets cold outside, so you come inside, unless you're out of fuel oil. These are things that you learn in Londinium, to have plenty of fuel and a comfortable place to wait out the storm, as we do. Dramaticus is here. We're in our famous wine bar, and the Centurions gathered early. I think they started drinking before us, but they count on us to show up to entertain them. And we are. We're going to begin with Germanicus's essay of the Ukrainian war about symbology of the Ukrainian war, and it draws on the genius of the Iliad, which you will all remember dominated the romantic lives of Rome and Greece before them, and Etruscans before them, and Carthaginians contemporaneously. Iliad, that story of the siege of Troy and the end of the story with people throwing their children into flames, dominated their imaginations. It was television, it was Hollywood, it was the internet, all wrapped up into one, episode after episode repeated. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. You've taken the symbols of the 2,000-year-old world and applied them to the events of these last years in the Ukrainian conflict, Russia versus Kyiv or Russia versus Brussels. Take your pick. Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. The Ukraine war, or the Russo-Ukrainian war, is yet another example of how war can transform an event that is intended to be quick and decisive, and the transformation will create something not only different, not only tragic, but also something that needs to take on a kind of legendary and mythic significance. And so the short war that the U.S. thought would topple the tall towers of the Kremlin, and Mr. Putin's idea of a special military operation that would last only a few days, transformed into a war that has many of the aspects and dimensions of the Iliad in terms of the hubris that has been demonstrated all round by both sides, or all sides, I should say, since there's so many, by the tragedy of loss and of destruction, and of the fact that the war will, in all likelihood, end in a kind of false transcendence, with Ukraine, like Troy, wrecked and destroyed in flames, of electrical generators and transformers exploding in the ether, and Russia with a victory that might be characterized as Pyrrhic, in the sense that Russia survived as a great nation and is unified in its focus, in its identity, and yet which went through this incredible passage of blood, as did Ukraine. And what happens here is that war inevitably, when it takes on this kind of existential dimension, calls upon literature and the enduring timeless products of literature, myth and legend, to turn the war into something meaningful, something that will redound through the ages. And that includes the defeated as well as the victor. So, for example, famously, the Confederacy was able to transform its horrible, tragic fate into something grand and enduring, which is often called the lost cause. And so I think Ukraine will focus on creating, through, again, mythic, legendary narrative structure, a story that will try and make sense of their terrible sacrifice in this war. Russia, which has also suffered, though clearly not nearly as dearly as Ukraine, Russia will have to make this war a phoenix-like story of Russia's rising again and of its national transcendence, its ability to endure another coalition, not unlike the coalitions of Napoleon or the coalition of the European alliance during the time of the Third Reich. And so the blueprints are all there. And what my essay attempted to explore is how the actual events of the war begin to matter less than the way in which they are positioned to serve as the lineaments or the attachment points or anchors by becoming a skein, a series of sacred symbols that in turn become touchstones for people, so that the war makes sense and that its sacrifices are important, even if the outcome is tragic. And in that sense, I think it's incredibly important to understand how badly NATO and the United States miscalculated, because rather than reducing Russia, and in its attempt to celebrate Ukraine, it created something that it had no control over. And so now the US has become, if you will, the midwife to a new myth and a kind of legendary story cycle of Russia reemerging, Russia transcendent. And I think that in not understanding this dimension of war, in maintaining a wholly material approach to war as basically a transaction in search of stuff, as one naval officer said to me once, we miss the entire reality of unfolding before us. And by not being able to comprehend what has actually happened in this war, in terms of the transformation of both Ukraine and Russia as societies, with one wrecked and one victorious, they both have become transfigured by this experience, whereas we cannot even begin to touch this incredible opera that has unfolded, and we just see everything in material terms, which is one of the reasons why the US cannot possibly pursue a course of war that will result in anything like victory. And the reason that we were able to do so in World War II is that we had framed World War II in mythic and legendary terms, which were clear and not only compelling, but mesmeric to the collective identity of America. And everyone embraced that, body and soul. And the result was something spectacular. It was the American transcendence. And we don't know what that means anymore. So we miss what happened, for example, in Vietnam. We missed what happened in Afghanistan. And we'll keep missing it until we're finally put through an experience of our own that forces us to confront um, the existential elements that war brings out.
The end of the Trojan War was Aeneid, we're told, by the Romans. Aeneid set sail with other Trojans who were driven away from their burned down city. And they sailed the Mediterranean for years, including touching at Carthage, and eventually settled on what became the founding of the city of Rome. In other words, their defeat turned into a great victory in the future. Do you see that possibility raised in Kiev now? The defeat of Kiev as Troy will lead to a success.
It is like that long-lived Confederate slogan, "The South will rise again," of course. That will be hatched as a prospective story to be fulfilled in the future, and we'll see whether or not that can be attained. It's a shaky proposition, but the core of Ukraine, meaning the core of Western non-Russian Ukraine, which goes back time immemorial almost, that will take this war as a foundation for the next Ukraine. And Russia, of course, has its heroic narrative structure already in place, and everyone knows what it is in Russia, and everyone has embraced it. The calculus in Russia right now is entirely focused with great concentration on making sure that the ending, the denouement of this war fulfills the requirements of this narrative structure. And in other words, that it take on a kind of ceremonial, mythic aspect that will form the framework of Russian identity in the decades ahead.
So it's fixed. It's done. There's no changing it now. Troy and Greeks.
What I try to do in the essay is get into the nitty gritty of how the most blood-soaked mud and death of the trenches gets transformed into something that has a mystical quality to it.
Mhm.
And that is what happened in the Iliad. The Iliad, as you read it, is just a gritty tale of hand-to-hand combat and all sorts of
Oh, body parts flying all over the place.
fighting at the ships. There's Ajax on the prow with his spear, and it goes on and on and on. And that's exactly the landscape, the texture, the feel of the Ukrainian war.
Germanicus and Gaius in our the centurions are pleased, Germanicus. Well done. Especially because they become the inheritors of the Trojan defeat here in Rome. And Aeneas touches all the bases and gives us a success. And I mentioned a model that is used in the 19th to 20th century. I've recently learned, Germanicus, which I wasn't sure that I knew before, that the Brits presented themselves as Greeks to the Roman Americans. Have you heard that?
They did under duress after they fell from grace. So effectively, World War II became Britain's cynocephale, the defeat of the Macedonians by Rome. And the only way Greece could cope with Roman domination was to find another pathway to extending their superiority over Rome, which they eventually did.
It's very nice that they did that.
Yeah.
At first I thought, no, surely Germanicus wrote this in the margin so I'd see it. This is a trick. Nope, there it was. Germanicus and Gaius in the wine bar, and the centurions are pleased. So we're going to move to something that's not so pleasing, which is a geopolitical warfare going on right now using a man named Epstein. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. It's very cold outside. It's going to be a slog going home, but we will stop by the Temple of Augustus and sacrifice dutifully. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here, and we turn our attention on a very cold night in Londinium, with the wind blowing across the Thames, hitting the ice sheets that are along the banks, and coming up here to our wine bar. But we build a big fire. The centurions are taking care of the environment as we tell stories that sometimes please the centurions, sometimes not. They're retired, so they're not fearful of being called out again. I turn to a headline from the 21st century that requires explanation. Dateline Moscow, Reuters. The Kremlin said it did not want to waste time answering questions about unproven suggestions in Western media and by Poland's premier, Donald Tusk, that the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein may have been some sort of Russian intelligence asset. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that Warsaw would launch an investigation into what it said were possible links between Epstein and Russia's intelligence services, also into any potential impact on Poland. Germanicus, the Epstein files are a fascination for those who are online. This, however, is not about the Epstein files. This is about Poland and Russia using the Epstein news as well, the Epstein gossip, as a weapon against each other. It strikes me as very smart on Tusk's part, because espionage is not something you prove in court. It's not the day you're convinced. It's always in the shadows. And it's very smart on the Russian part to say we're not going to waste time, meaning, of course, they want you to waste time to think about it. These two dogs are going to fight, Germanicus, and this is the way they do it right now. What is your measure of using any particular scandal against the other side? Is it a fair geopolitics? Is it successful? In Rome, we always know to use any time we have a difficulty with a city-state. We bring up the Carthage example and make sure that they hear it from us first. You will be destroyed if you don't obey us. How about Poland? Is it effective?
Poland is using a powerful fetish in the form of how we understand not merely Jeffrey Epstein, but the entire nimbus, the entire aura of corruption that he embodies. And as this kind of magical totem, waving around Jeffrey Epstein is a way of legitimating the bad things out there that you are in opposition to, and which are inarguable in any chamber of debate. There is no debating the reality of guilt by association once the name Epstein is invoked. And what Tusk is doing is to take the inarguable evil of Epstein and associate it with Russia in a way that clearly sets up a kind of heroic one-on-one opposition or confrontation between the evil, as in tainted by Epstein, and the fact that he was the Lord, the devil, if you will, of all deceit and all sinful opportuning. And therefore, essentially, Mr. Putin is in league with Satan himself. And therefore, the righteous Catholic Poland can raise its cross in opposition, once again, to Russia. And we have to keep the backstory foremost in our minds here. We all remember, of course we don't, that Poland occupied, rather the Polish hussars occupied the Kremlin in Moscow for several years in the early 17th century. So essentially from the late 1500s until today, a fairly hefty period of time, Russia and Poland have been going at it pretty much hammer and tongs to the best of their ability. And so, what this betokens, it seems to me, is not is a strategic pathway, a kind of concerted and, if not well thought out, then highly deliberate course of action on the part of Tusk and Poland to set itself up as the bastion of Europe, because the former bastion of Europe against the infidel and evil, which was Ukraine, is about to fall. And so, in a way, he can say, Poland, the most vigorous and well armed state in the EU, with the most cohesive and, fruitful population at this point, is now going to assume a very prominent position, while at the same time not being considered as a second tier power within the constellation of the EU itself. In other words, he's staking out Poland again, as in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, as the great power defending Europe. Because you remember also, Poland was the pivotal uh, republic that stopped the Ottoman Turks at the Second Siege of Vienna in 1686. So you have this champion reasserting itself, and at the same time freeing itself from the entanglement of the European Union. And of course, it's worth noting that this pathway has already been, cleared to an extent, as it were, by Mr. Orban in Hungary. And so you have also in Czechia, and possibly even Romania, if it ever gets a fair election, you have a kind of more traditional, more heroically minded league of Central European states, very reminiscent in some ways of the Petit Entente after World War I, except this would not be under any sort of French influence. It represents and maybe is consciously pursuing a differentiation between the icon of a vigorous Central Eastern Europe, free, democratic, and militarily strong, versus a corrupt, divided, mongrelized Western Europe.
It's successful then. Tusk got what he wanted already. Your measure?
He can, if he's able to articulate this completely. In other words, it has to be a complete vision for Poland. Like, here's the way ahead, and it diverges from, the lady bosses of the European Union.
Well, Russia has given itself no advantage in dragging out the Ukraine war. No advantage there whatsoever. Poland is in a position to step forward and confront Russia. Is that what he's doing?
Well, he is, and he realizes that it's a safe gambit, in large part because Russia's suffered in this war, and it doesn't want to risk further extending itself. And Russia, I think, is also happy to let this play out, because if you think about it, there's an advantage to Russia having a strong Poland against which it can say, in other words, Russia's response to this can actually help elevate Poland in the eyes of the world. And that actually creates a symbiotic relationship strategically between Poland and Russia. On the surface, it looks like they're foes ready to fight, but in reality, they have committed to each other to continue to keep them both in a good position. This works to Russia's advantage also in the final resolution of hostilities and the disposition of Ukraine as a sovereign state, in large part because Poland covets Western Ukraine, which was Polish for so long, so many centuries.
Polish or Lithuanian, either one. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the you know a a successor Ukrainian state under Polish tutelage is a good outcome for Poland because it makes Poland a great power in ways that it can represent on a map geographically. But it also is a good outcome for Russia because now Poland is managing a untrustworthy, fractious Ukraine, and therefore takes a load off Russia. And in effect, what looks like an opposition, like say a Cold War, is in reality a way of dividing the spoils in a way that supports each other, just like the United States and the Soviet Union supported each other in terms of their spheres of influence, like say NATO for the US, and Russia had its empire, and the fact that we were titular enemies or foes in prospect served to keep those places firmly under each of our respective spheres.
End of the Republic. I've had an opinion voiced about what happens at the end of the Republic when we come back. Michael Leos is Germanicus. I am John Batchelor, Gaius in Londinium, 92 AD, the very cold winter. 5 weeks till spring. We'll be right back. This is the Friends of History Debating Society and the fans of the Friends of History Debating Society, all gathered in our wine bar by the Thames. Nobody's crossing the Thames tonight. And one of our late arriving retired centurions opened the door and everybody yelled at him, "Close it quickly. Good heavens, it's blowing a storm out there." Fortunately, we're warm and tucked up in the wine bar, speculating about 2,000 years from now. But I want to address immediately the end of the Republic, which happened somewhere between 28 BCE and 14 AD. Somewhere in there, the Republic ended. Augustus, the great god Augustus, putting together an empire that will last hundreds of years, thousands of years. Germanicus, the suggestion is this, not original, I read about it, that the end of the Republic is marked not by corruption, but by making what is corrupt legal, lawful, so that people can feel uncomfortable when they see it, but there's no law against it. What do you make of that?
The highly complex, unwritten constitutional order of the Roman Republic depended on collective adherence to all of its many regulations, and it enshrined and exalted integrity and selflessness on the part of office holders and leaders. And that broke down over the course of centuries. Mainly, it broke down, however, quite clearly at the end of the Second Punic War, when the Romans went into Greece and the optimates became incredibly rich off the spoils of the war with Macedonia and then all the other wars, the Mithridatic Wars, etc.
The price of slaves went down. We had so many.
And slavery was the other part because Rome became a slave economy in Italy, and it disenfranchised over the course of decades the essential symbiosis between the the regular guys, the farmers who would then, when called, don their legionary army and do their duty. And the relationship they had with the optimates, their leaders, was one in which both sides respected each other and protected each other. And when that began to come apart, the regular guys, the populares, they looked to big men who could succor them and protect them, protect their
Great
property.
Crassus and Caesar, for example.
That's right. And they, they were just as corrupt in their own way, especially Crassus and Pompey, etc. That yes, corruption was breaking down over the course of decades the sinews of integrity and discipline in the Roman constitutional order. So, what do you do in a world of corruption, which is going to degrade, if not destroy, all trust that citizens used to have in their government?
You accept.
You accept it, but there has to be a way of that acceptance can be attained or even purchased. And of course, we know about the purchasing because one of the things Augustus did was to, although it goes back to Caesar, was to create the annona, where citizens of Rome got bread, wine, sardines, olive oil, and essentially it was welfare. And that helped to buy off the disenfranchised, now landless Roman citizenry. But also, it helps if you know that the corruption has been regularized and systematized so that there are boundaries to the corruption and that there is recourse at some level to bad actors if it comes to the attention of the emperor and the emperor is a good emperor. In other words, there's still this sense that there can be some justice. And this is what Augustus was able to do. He regularized and systematized the corruption, and the really bad actors were in fact punished. And that was the system that worked through much of the empire. It changed, of course, with the Justinianic Code.
It was no longer a republic. That ended.
No, but I mean, the empire itself was full of corruption, but the empire got less corrupt as it went on. Paradoxically, part of this was due, I think, to Christianity, and part of it was due to the magnificent work of Justinian in creating a new law code, and that really helped things, believe it or not. But the truth is that corruption is there everywhere, but if it cannot be contained through custom and taboo, which is essentially how it was contained in the Roman Republic, where everybody policed each other through their expectations of good behavior and their decrying of bad behavior. And that when that delicate and complex cultural system broke down, there had to be another way in order to make things continue to work. And what's interesting is that Augustus did that. And I think in many ways, that's what Putin did to the world of the corrupt oligarchs in Russia. They're still there, but they're pretty much cowed, and there are all sorts of ways in which the corruption is systematized and given boundaries. What is so frightening about what's happening in the United States now, and I mean frightening in a deep sort of existential way, is that there are no checks on the corruption, and the incredibly quick rise of America's oligarchs who are several orders of magnitude more powerful than any Russian oligarch, for example. Their power is at such a level that corruption it can't even be contained. And that's what one of the things about the Epstein files
It's
is that
lawful.
it pulls the curtain away.
It's lawful. It's not, you can't contain what is lawful.
That's right. And because, when you say, oh, he's got the lawyers, well, that basically means you can turn crime into something that's either legal or that can't be prosecuted.
So we're there.
Yes, we're there, and it's very scary to the vast majority of Americans.
Which is why we're so far from Rome, gentlemen. The centurions are all nodding. Very far from Rome. And a night like this, we're even farther. Nobody's going to venture out and travel all the way to Londinium to say, you fellows are dissenters. Germanicus, Michael Blahos, Gaius, John Batchelor, in a very happy Londinium wine bar, waiting for spring, and more evidence of this transformation of Keefe into Troy. I'm John Batchelor.